Good day. Today is Friday, 7th February 2025, and somewhat unusually for recent programs, I'm going to start this program with a brief summary of military developments in Ukraine, because as I've discussed in many places, it is military developments that are ultimately driving the broader diplomatic and geopolitical picture. So, the first thing to say is that this morning, just a short time ago in fact, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the town of Toretsk has now come fully under Russian control. The statement from the Russian Defense Ministry is short and it reads as follows. As a result of active offensive actions, the Center Group of Forces, units of the 1st, 9th and 132nd Guards, separate motorized rifle brigades of the 51st Army, and veteran volunteer formations liberated Dzerzhinsk. Dzerzhinsk is the name of the city of Toretsk, according to Russia. Incidentally, Dzerzhinsk commemorates Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka, the Soviet secret police agency, and a close associate of the first Soviet leader and founder of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin. But anyway, the city is the same city as Toretsk. It's known to most people around the world as Toretsk. I have consistently referred to it as Toretsk in programs on this channel, and I'm going to stick to doing so. But to repeat again, the official name of the city in Russian is Dzerzhinsk, and now that it has passed fully under Russian control, it will probably revert to that name, at least for the time being. So anyway, Toretsk has now passed fully under Russian control. I believe this is the biggest urban center that the Russian military have captured since the capture of Bakhmut in the first months of 2023. Now, following the capture of Toretsk, lots of other things can now begin to happen. There are reports that the Russian forces have already started to move north of Toretsk into the fields, north of this town, population of about, well, it peaked at about 50,000, as I understand, during the period of the Soviet Union. Anyway, the Russians will now no doubt move northwards, and they will be moving northwards towards the rather bigger town of Konstantinovka, population before the war of around 70,000, though I don't expect the Russians to make an attempt to storm Konstantinovka until the Battle of Chasiv Yar is resolved. And this has been a prolonged battle, the battle for Chasiv Yar. But I suspect that now that Toretsk has fallen, the Russians will give Chasiv Yar more attention. And the Russians control, by my estimate, around 70% of Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians have already been pushed towards the more outlying areas of the town. I read a report earlier today saying that the Ukrainian defense in Chasiv Yar is becoming increasingly disorganized as the supply situation for Ukrainian troops in Chasiv Yar becomes disrupted. I think most people who've been following the situation in Chasiv Yar feel that probably sometime in March, Chasiv Yar will also pass completely under Russian control. So this has been the big news. Now, I should say, and this is just for the record, that the Institute for the Study of War in Washington, the place which most Western journalists go to for updates about the war, has at regular intervals discussed the Battle of Toretsk, and at regular intervals it has expressed doubts that the Russians would capture Toretsk. And the reason they say that the Russians would be unlikely to capture Toretsk is because the Russians are overextended, and in particular, Group of Forces Center, the command led by General Mordvichev, is especially overextended because they are the people who have also been conducting the offensive in the area of Pokrovsk and who captured places like Novogrodivka and Selidovo, and they've also been advancing north recently from the village of Vozvizhenka that they captured a little time ago. So the Institute for the Study of War repeatedly said that the Russians didn't have enough forces to complete the capture of Toretsk. Well, we see that that was wrong. I don't myself doubt that the Russians did commit fewer forces to the capture of Toretsk than they have to their offensive towards Pokrovsk and in the areas south of Pokrovsk. But the forces that they did commit proved to be enough, despite the fact that Toretsk was a very heavily fortified place. Major defense lines created in the Toretsk area going all the way back to 2014. Toretsk was one of the major fortified positions created by the Ukrainians when they set up their defense lines in 2014, the very same defense lines that the Russians have for 3 years struggled to overcome. So now it's fair to say that all the major frontline cities, Krasnogorovka, Avdeevka, Toretsk, the village of Pesky, all of these places, plus two of the major base areas, base towns, Selidovo and Kurakhovo, they've all fallen under Russian control. The major Ukrainian defense lines west of Donetsk city and the neighboring city of Gorlovka, also under Russian control, they have fallen to the Russians. And this, even as the Russians have gradually succeeded in breaking through Ukrainian defenses in the south with the capture of Ugledar and more recently of Velika Novosilka. This has been a year of continuous Russian offensives beginning in October 2023. They continued right through 2024, and now in February 2025 the Russians have captured their biggest prize so far. Just saying. So anyway, that's Toretsk. There's been lots of things going on in other places too. To quickly wrap up on what the Russians have been doing, the Russians have continued to expand their two bridgeheads west of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers. I discussed this in a recent program. I am not going to go into the details. The Russians have also apparently now captured all of the village of Dachny, south of Kurakhovo, and most of the village of Andreevka, somewhat to the west. And it looks as if Ukrainian defenses southwest of Kurakhovo, the last fortified positions in this area, west of the Dnieper, that these fortifications, these fortified villages, are also about to fall. Now, in a recent program, I discussed how the new Ukrainian Ground Forces commander, General Drapati, had obviously been given orders by Zelensky to launch various counterattacks. He did launch a series of counterattacks, specifically in the Pokrovsk area, in the village of Kotlino, southwest of Pokrovsk, and apparently towards the village of Pishanye, also in that general area. The reports from the Russians are that all of these offensives, all of these counterattacks have been defeated with heavy losses, and that the Russians have successfully expanded the area that they controlled southwest of Kotlino, in the village of Udachne, which lies on the main railway tracks. And the Russians today are claiming that after the failure of the Ukrainian counterattacks in the Pokrovsk area, the Ukrainians are now transferring troops from the Pokrovsk area to Kursk region, whereas we will see in a moment the Ukrainians have attempted another offensive. Now, this has been said today to the official Russian TASS news agency by our old friends, the security agencies. I assume that means the Russian Defense Ministry. Anyway, they are saying to TASS, the enemy, that's to say the Ukrainians, have redeployed some of their forces to the Kursk section of the front line from the areas of Pokrovsk, Slavyansk and Dobropolye. And according to the security agencies, the Ukrainian army is trying to select units with the highest combat readiness, leading recently mobilized and penalized soldiers in Donbass, which is interesting. It would suggest that once again, Zelensky is insisting that Kursk be given priority over other areas along the combat line, with the result being that just as a couple of days ago, we were getting reports that troops had been redeployed from Kursk region to try to stem the Russian advance west of the Oskol River. Now, other troops have been redeployed from Pokrovsk to try to continue the offensive that the Ukrainians are now trying to launch in Kursk. More examples, in other words, of the Ukrainians juggling their forces from one place to the other, trying to stem Russian advances, but also trying to focus on their offensive in Kursk region. Now, before I get to that offensive, which has attracted an inordinate amount of attention over the last 24 hours and which has led to a somewhat euphoric series of comments from Zelensky himself, I just wanted to say that there's been a long article about the state of the war in the Wall Street Journal. And of course, it makes many claims about the state of the two armies, not all of which I think are borne out by actual events. But it makes the admission that the Ukrainians are desperately short of men. It claims that in many parts of the front lines now, the Ukrainians are outnumbered 5-1. Extraordinary, if true. It says that the Ukrainians are short of men to man the trenches. And, well, I have to say that all of this seems to me to be consistent with what we're seeing starting to happen, or at least increasingly happening on the ground. The Russians are able to maneuver on the battlefronts to an extent that they've never done previously. They began to engage in maneuvers which would have been seen as too risky earlier in the war, from about the beginning of the summer. And that pattern has continued ever since then. And as I discussed recently in another program that I did, we see villages fortified villages and fortified positions, which earlier in the war, it would have taken the Russians weeks or months to capture. They tend to fall now within days when the Russians reach them. And so far, we are only talking about villages. But I wonder if before long, we're going to see the same start to happen with towns and then eventually cities. Just saying. Anyway, that's the situation on the main contact line. Let's now turn to the offensive that the Ukrainians have been launching in Kursk region. Now, this is the second offensive that the Ukrainians have launched in Kursk region over the course of the last 2 months. They launched another offensive some weeks ago towards the village of Berdin, in the northern part of the front lines, near the village of Ruskaya Porechnoye. That offensive ended catastrophically and resulted in a Russian counterattack, which recently resulted in the capture by the Russians of the village of Ruskaya Porechnoye, and which opened the way for the Russians to advance further to the point where there's now apparently Russian forces inside Sverdlikovo, another important village to the northwest of Sudzha, close to the main road, supplying the Ukrainians from Sumy region in Ukraine, the Ukrainian troops in Kursk region. Well, the Ukrainians, Zelensky, however, continue to be profoundly committed to the Kursk operation. And Zelensky recently made comments to the effect that the Ukrainians have been 6 months in Kursk region, that the Russians haven't been able to push them out of Kursk region up to now, that they intend to remain there, that they will go on fighting there. And Zelensky made some, I thought, astonishingly ill-judged and frankly euphoric comments about the fact that the Ukrainians are again on the attack in Kursk region. Now, from what I can judge, and most of the reports have been, well, there have been reports from both sides, but the reports suggest that the main focus of the Ukrainian attack is in the area to the south of Sudzha, with the Ukrainians focusing on trying to recapture the important village of Ruskaya Konopelka that the Russians captured in this area some weeks ago now. Anyway, one always gets differing accounts as to what exactly happened. But the Russians and the Russian Defense Ministry have provided lots of details, including lots of film. And it's clear to me that Ruskaya Konopelka, at least as of the time of making of this program, continues to be under Russian control. And it looks to me, putting all the information from both sides together, as if all of the Ukrainian attacks south of Sudzha, for the moment at least, have failed, and have failed badly. That the Russians appear to have been aware of and expecting this attack, just as they appear to have known about the Berdin attack before it was launched some weeks ago, that the Russians were waiting, that their forces were assembled, their air force apparently has been active, as well as their artillery, and anyway, that they've been able to knock out large amounts of Ukrainian armoured vehicles, large numbers of Ukrainian armoured vehicles, and they provide pictures of this. And the very latest reports, as immediately before I made this program, suggest that not only have the attacks, the Ukrainian attacks, been a complete failure, but that the Russians are now busy mopping up and hunting the various scattered Ukrainian troops who are trying to escape from the battle towards Suja across the fields. Now, we are not talking here, now this is an important thing to say, we are not talking here of a huge offensive. Thousands of men, hundreds of armoured vehicles, large numbers of tanks, and that kind of thing. The fighting in Kursk region tends to be usually battles between dozens of men on either side, rather than hundreds of men on either side. This battle, this offensive, does seem to have been a bit bigger. The Russians claimed that around 200 Ukrainian troops were killed. That's what the Russians are saying. I stress this is a Russian claim. I can't verify it. And that, as I said, that the attacks have been repelled, assuming that there is any truth to these Russian claims. We're looking at perhaps an attack by 1 or 2 battalions of Ukrainian troops, perhaps 6 or 7 or 1,000 men altogether. As I said, not a huge offensive. But whatever, it was apparently a big attack by the standards of the operations in Kursk region. And according to the Russians, it's failed. Now, that was yesterday. There have been few reports today. There are suggestions that the attack, that there have been no further attacks by the Ukrainians today, at least as of now. It could be that there have been, and that they have been more successful. We will just have to wait and see. But here again, I come back to the key point. What do these attacks avail? How do they avail? How do they benefit Ukraine and its overall position in the war? Zelensky and some people around him appear to have given themselves a hugely exaggerated sense of the importance of Kursk region, of this battle for Kursk region, in the overall scheme of things. The Russians and I myself take the clear view that the original objective of the Kursk operation, when it was launched in August, was to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant. I don't think anybody any longer thinks that that is a remotely achievable objective now. But it seems that at some point over the last couple of months, Zelensky, who has a deep aversion, clearly, to withdrawal from any place. Anyway, Zelensky seems to have convinced himself that Kursk, because it lies within the territory of pre-2014 Russia, is seen as being critically important to the Kremlin, that the Kremlin will make significant concessions in negotiations in order to regain control of Kursk region, and that the fighting, therefore, in Kursk region must continue regardless of the cost, and the Ukrainians must continue to go on fighting there. So the Ukrainians pour men and machines into Kursk region. They try and conduct counterattacks in Kursk region. They go on fighting for this place, disregarding the fact that we are talking about one small piece of territory in the vast territory, continental huge territory of Russia, the world's biggest country, that the town that is at the center of all this fighting now, Suja, is a small place which before the war perhaps had a population of 6,000 people, that there's only one main road, that most of the other roads are very small, that the terrain is hilly and forested and bisected by little streams, that the territory is thinly inhabited, that in its totality it is not that important, certainly not to the Kremlin, and cannot be put at the same level of importance as places like Toretsk, which the Russians, of course, have just captured. Now, I'm going to suggest here that one of the reasons that the Ukrainians launched this counterattack in Kursk region, a counterattack which, if we believe the early reports, has already failed, and which might ultimately fail catastrophically, but which, even if it succeeds, can only achieve very ephemeral gains at insignificant cost. I'm going to suggest that the major reason why Zelensky has ordered this offensive in Kursk region at this particular point in time is because he knows that the Russians have captured Toretsk, that they were about to announce the capture of Toretsk, and that he doesn't want people talking about the fact that Toretsk, a major industrial center, a heavily fortified area, a place which, if you look at all of the various surrounding villages and communities, including New York and Druzhba and all of the others, had perhaps an aggregate population of around 50, maybe 60,000. Anyway, he doesn't want people to talk about the fact that Ukraine has just lost this critically important area of territory, this major fortified position on the front lines in Donbass. He wants people to be talking instead about battles for a small village, Ruskaya Konopielka, which, of course, cannot in any objective way compare in significance with what has happened in Toretsk. Anyway, that's my assessment of Zelensky's position. More men and machines are being sacrificed in Kursk region for ephemeral gains. More attempts to maintain a narrative of Ukrainian resistance, even as the Wall Street Journal tells us that the Ukrainian army is now desperately short of men and is critically overextended and wasting away. All of this to draw attention away from the fall of Toretsk and ultimately to fool the West and General Kellogg and Donald Trump about the real situation in the war, to preserve the illusion that there is still some kind of stalemate going on, that the war that is being fought is somehow at a standstill, that the Russians continue to suffer huge losses. Zelensky has recently claimed that the total number of Ukrainian soldiers killed is just 45,000. I don't think anybody, by the way, believes him. But anyway, that's what he said. Whereas the Russian losses are multiples greater, and that if the war goes on, if the fighting goes on, well, nonetheless and somehow, Ukraine can pull through. All it needs is for the West and for the United States in particular to go on backing Ukraine. Now, I say all of that again, and this is perhaps one of the most concerning things following on from what I discussed in my program yesterday. I get the clear sense that some people in the United States still cling to these stories, these fables that the Ukrainians have been disseminating. Yesterday on the Duran, my colleague Alex Christoforou and I did a live stream with Colonel Jacques Beau of the Swiss Army. And Colonel Beau, as we discussed in that program, is somebody who has written most eruditely about the Russian military and how it thinks and how it fights. And Colonel Beau said over the course of that program that one of the great difficulties in discussing the war and in making correct decisions about policy is the pervasiveness of all of the myths and narratives that have been spun about it. So we had 2 years of claims from February 2022 until the end of 2024 that the Ukrainians were actually winning, that all it needed was a further push and that eventually the Russians would lose. There were doubts, some doubts began to appear in the summer of 2023, but the fiction that the Ukrainians were winning persisted until pretty much the end of 2023. And then we've had, since then, the new narrative that the war is in some kind of stalemate, even as the Russians have been advancing continuously since October 2023, breaking down resistance, breaking through all of the great Ukrainian defense lines, defeating the Ukrainians, capturing key places like Toretsk, which has just fallen. Anyway, that narrative launched in sometime in the winter of 2024, early spring of 2024. And of course, it was still the dominant narrative when General Kellogg appears to have formed his views in April 2024 and wrote his famous report, which has been much commented and talked about and circulated. And it continues to be, I think, the narrative that General Kellogg clings on to and which has been sold to Donald Trump, that the Russians are suffering appalling losses, that they're not really making any progress, that such progress as they're making is of no real significance, that it's being achieved at extraordinary cost. And I'm afraid that in General Kellogg's case, and apparently also in the case of Mike Waltz, Donald Trump's new national security advisor, this narrative not only has shaped their views of the conflict, but it is leading them down increasingly unfortunate pathways. So I said yesterday that General Kellogg is going to announce his plan, has said that he's going to announce his plan at the Munich Security Conference. Now, I said that was on the 20th of February, but I got the date wrong. It'll be sometime between 14th February and 16th February. In other words, over the weekend. It's strange that it has taken General Kellogg this long to actually put together his plan. Apparently the intention is that after this plan has been announced at the Munich Security Conference, General Kellogg will then fly to Kiev when he's going to try to persuade Vladimir Zelensky to accept this plan. Now, the Daily Mail in London has published what it says this plan is. Except, of course, that what the Daily Mail has published as some sort of purported exclusive turns out to be the so-called peace plan that was published by Strana, the Ukrainian magazine, and which I commented on in detail some 2 weeks ago. I said at the time that there were some elements in this plan which might interest the Russians. It did accept, for example, that Ukraine would not be able to join NATO, and it did make at least apparent moves towards recognizing Russian concerns about the status of Russians inside Ukraine itself, but that overall the plan would be unacceptable to the Russians. It did not address their main issues. And even on the vexed question of Ukraine's NATO membership, it didn't provide the Russians with anything remotely approaching the kind of safeguards that they would need in order to feel that they had achieved their objectives in the conflict. Specifically, what the plan proposes is that Ukraine changes its constitution back to declaring that it will remain a neutral country, and that alongside that, the NATO Council will issue a statement that NATO accepts Ukraine's neutrality and no longer seeks Ukraine's membership in NATO. I said that the Russians would be unlikely to accept that because all of this could simply be reversed again at any time. Ukraine previously had a provision in its constitution that Ukraine would never join NATO, and it changed that to a commitment that Ukraine would achieve NATO membership. And the NATO Council, well, the members of NATO individually back in 1990 and 1991 and for a short time after that, gave repeated assurances to the Russians that NATO would not be expanded eastwards. And then, of course, NATO was expanded eastwards. And in 2008, NATO effectively committed itself to bringing Ukraine into NATO. So the Russians are not going to accept such unilateral and easily reversed moves as sufficient to answer their underlying security concerns. But beyond that, there is the further factor that the plan that was outlined in Strana and which has now reappeared in the Daily Mail envisages that Ukraine will be able to retain armed forces of whatever size it wants, and that the United States will continue to reserve to itself the right to arm and equip those armed forces. And again, I said that this made it all but inconceivable that the Russians would agree to this, because it renders every other part of the plan unenforceable. If Ukraine were to revert to seeking NATO membership, if Ukraine were to renege on its commitments to protect the rights of Russians, the fact that Ukraine, again, had powerful armed forces would make it very difficult or even impossible for the Russians to enforce all of the remaining terms. So I said that in its existing form, despite making some moves in the Russian direction, it seemed to me that this plan, as outlined by Strana, was one that the Russians would not be able to accept. And in fact, in statements that Russian officials have made since the publication by Strana of that plan, they have made that very, very clear. Now, at the time when this plan first appeared, I speculated, following denials from Zelensky's office, denials, by the way, which still continue, that this so-called plan had in fact been provided to Ukraine by the United States. I suggested that this plan actually more likely had its origins within Ukraine itself. Even at that time, and we are talking about 2 weeks ago, it was becoming clear that opposition to Zelensky in Kiev was starting to re-emerge, that there were considerable concerns about the fact that there'd been the stop aid order from Washington, and that, by the way, apparently still continues. It continues certainly with respect to all the financial and economic and other aid that Ukraine has been receiving from the United States. Military supplies, of course, do still continue. Though I understand, despite contrary claims, that these continue to have been significantly reduced as well over the last few weeks. Anyway, I said that this was creating concerns in Kiev, that it was causing opposition to Zelensky to revive, and in fact, in the 2 weeks since I made that claim, we've seen further evidence of this. We've seen criticisms of Zelensky by people like the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, and we have seen comments from Ukraine's intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, saying that Ukraine has only about 6 months left. Beyond those 6 months, basically, it's curtains. The military situation is becoming desperate, that in order to survive, Ukraine needs a peace agreement, and otherwise, the situation will become disastrous. And I pointed out that this comment of Budanov's is in fact consistent with a report we got a few weeks ago in the Washington Post, I think it was, which disclosed that way back in April of last year, there had been a meeting in Washington between defense officials, members of various think tanks, in other words, the US military intelligence apparatus, and Ukrainian intelligence, which almost certainly included Budanov himself, and that the Ukrainians already then, that is as far back as April 2024, were telling the Americans that in conventional terms, the war was lost, that Ukraine was losing the war, and that at that time, that is to say back in April 2024, a decision was made to start seeking asymmetric measures to try to correct or adjust this advantage that the Russians had achieved. And well, we've seen over the last couple of months what those asymmetric measures were. The attack in Kursk and the attempt to capture the nuclear power station there. The assassinations of various people in Russia itself. And to all that, we must add the various drone attacks that have been taking place across Russia, carried out by Ukraine, about whose effectiveness I'm going to return to shortly in this program. Anyway, that was in April, and clearly all these asymmetric warfare attempts have been unsuccessful, and now it makes complete sense that Budanov, having seen the failure of all of that and having seen the advance of the Russians since April, that they're now coming back. Budanov is now coming back and says, look, we've just got 6 months and that the war is lost. And I have also suggested in programs that the person who almost certainly leaked the fact that Budanov had made that comment was Budanov himself. And sure enough, that seems to be the suspicion of Zelensky and Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff. And there are reports that Budanov is now under investigation. Just saying. Now, all of this confirms that Budanov is disagreeing with Zelensky. Klitschko is disagreeing with Zelensky. We can probably guess that former President Poroshenko is also commenting about Zelensky. He's unhappy with Zelensky. And there are reports that the perennial, profoundly corrupt, but nonetheless charismatic and highly intelligent Ukrainian veteran politician Yulia Tymoshenko, she's also back apparently, and she also seems to be maneuvering, and Zelensky cannot have failed but noticed that, unlike himself, she managed to wangle an invitation to Trump's inauguration, and as a result has, over the last few weeks, managed to find her way to Washington, where she has no doubt had discussions with Trump administration officials. So there is a body of opposition starting to develop in Kiev, and of course the fact that it is now known that the Americans are pushing for elections in Ukraine, which is code for saying that they want Zelensky to step down, all of that will undoubtedly have strengthened this impetus within Kiev to challenge Zelensky. And I'm going to suggest that it is this group of people, or some of them at least, perhaps mostly Budanov, who have indeed come up with this plan, this peace plan, which previously appeared in Strana, and which I am guessing someone amongst them has now managed to get republished and discussed in the Daily Mail. And I'm going to suggest that this is not actually a plan that originates with Kellogg, but it is a plan that this group within Kiev is trying to sell to Kellogg. They're telling him, look, we understand that there has to be peace. We understand that the situation is becoming catastrophic. We realize that we cannot lose the war. We realize that the president in the United States is losing patience with the war. We are reasonable people. We want to go for a compromise. And this is our proposal. We formally give up NATO membership. We change our constitution. NATO accepts that we cannot be members of the alliance. We still press forward, however, with EU membership. We retain our armed forces. We do not grant formal recognition of Russian control of the eastern regions that the Russians currently occupy. And of course, you continue to arm us in exactly the way that you have been doing before. And these are some of the same people, Poroshenko in particular, of course, who have previously made similar commitments to the Russians to try to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end. It was Poroshenko, for example, who signed the 2015, well, not the Minsk agreement itself, but the leaders' declaration that accompanied it and which included a commitment to having the Minsk agreement done, just saying. And no doubt all of these people are saying to each other, we have to have peace. The Americans are getting frustrated. Funding from the US is drying up. There's a limit to what the Europeans are going to do. Let's do the same thing that we did in Minsk. Come up with a proposal. It appears to give the Russians all of the things they want. We'll get the Americans to come on side. The Americans, Kellogg, will probably do that because, after all, this is pretty much what they want to see happen. And, well, hopefully Putin will fall for the bait, as he did way back in February 2015 in Minsk. And, well, if he doesn't, if the Russians reject this proposal and stick with their existing positions, well, we can then come to the Americans and to the Europeans and say, look, you can see we are reasonable people. We are trying to negotiate. It's the Russians who won't negotiate. They really are aggressive. They really are intent on taking over all of Ukraine. And unless you are prepared to sit back and let the Russians roll us over, you must continue to give military support to us and resume all of that financial support that you have up to now stopped. And of course, just to make one thing absolutely clear, we agree with you that Zelensky must go. We will take over. All we need is for you to press Zelensky to stand down so that we can have new elections, and then things will be an awful lot better for you and for us. This is what I think is going on. Now, let's get back to Kellogg. He's made a number of comments. He's said that this plan that he's going to announce is basically a plan for a ceasefire. He says that we have to have a ceasefire, we have to stop the war, we have to stop the killing, and only after that happens can we get down to negotiations. Now, already that is something that the Russians have said they will never accept. The Russians repeatedly pointed out that Minsk was essentially an agreement for a ceasefire. The Ukrainians made all kinds of commitments, which they were supposed to follow up with further negotiations. Those negotiations never substantively happened. The Ukrainians went back on their commitment to negotiate with the leaders of the Donbass republics. They continued to insist that those individuals, the leaders of the Donbass republics, were just cutouts and that they weren't going to negotiate with them. And they started to rebuild their army and to prepare for the next war. The Russians are not going to let themselves be maneuvered into that position again. So already, the very fact that Kellogg is talking about a ceasefire is something which, based on every comment every Russian official has made up to this point, tells me that whatever his diplomatic initiative is going to be, it is going to be rejected in Moscow. Now, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has been talking again. And he again has said that, yes, it is true they're getting all kinds of statements now from the United States about the need to end the conflict, to bring the conflict to an end. There's been talk about negotiations, about compromises, about all those things. The Russians, however, have still not received, this is according to Peskov, anything really concrete, anything that they can work with. And that strongly suggests to me that Kellogg actually doesn't have a worked out plan, but that this plan, which, as I said, I suspect has a Ukrainian origin, is the plan that he's going to announce eventually in Munich, if only because there is none other. So he's going to come, he's going to go to Kiev. I doubt that he's going to get a warm reception from Zelensky, but Zelensky has again said that he's prepared to sit down and negotiate with Putin, and no doubt he will now endorse the idea of a ceasefire. And then Kellogg will go to the Russians, and the Russians will of course say no. And then the question is, what do the Americans do? Now, according to reports that have been circulating, and which were circulating yesterday, Kellogg has been going around telling people that, as far as he's concerned, on a point of effectiveness from 1 to 10, the existing sanctions against Russia are at about 3, so that there is plenty of scope to harden them even more. And I gather that this is also the view of the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. If that is what Kellogg thinks, then I'm going to say straight away that that is completely delusional. If anybody had suggested back in February 2022 that the sanctions that are currently in force against Russia, which are the most thoroughgoing and extensive sanctions against any country in the world, are at level 3 instead of level 10, nobody would have accepted that. Just to repeat again, Russian central bank's reserves in the West have been frozen. Russian airliners can't fly to Europe or the United States. There's been essentially a cut-off of Russian pipeline gas to Europe. There's comprehensive restrictions on high technology sales to Russia. There is, endless numbers of sanctions against Russian individuals and Russian financial institutions. And virtually all Russian banks now have been cut off from SWIFT. And Kellogg says that these are only level 3 sanctions as opposed to level 10 sanctions. They are as tough as sanctions can be if they are addressed at any particular country. If the United States wants to tighten this sanctions regime even further, then it can only do so by going against the economic interests, not just of allies like Germany, which have behaved more like vassal states than allies, but of powerful countries around the world like China and India and others, and Brazil. Brazil has just announced, for example, that it is increasing imports of diesel fuel from Russia. Just saying. It's going to launch an attack on the vital economic interests of all of these countries, which they will all see as an attack on themselves, and which they are all certain to resist. I cannot imagine anything more counterproductive. And of course, it will almost certainly result in higher global inflation overall, because that is the effect of disrupting supply chains in this kind of way. And of course, it is going to take away any incentive on the Russian side to negotiate or any interest in moving forward to establish any sort of dialogue with the United States. So this whole approach that Kellogg and Mike Waltz seem to be drifting towards is remarkably ill-conceived and is not connected to the realities. Now, the first reality is the one that I've touched on at the start of this program when I did the summary of the military situation in Ukraine. With every day, the Russians continue to advance. There is a narrative that I've seen take hold that there's been a scaling down of the war. Apparently, the Russian Defense Ministry was announcing in November that Ukrainian irreplaceable losses every day were running at 2,300. That was in November. But now, supposedly, they have fallen to 1,600 a day. And that, we are told, is a sign that there has been less fighting. I'm not discussing here whether those Russian figures are true. All I will say is that anybody who thinks that a casualty rate for Ukraine of 1,600 men a day, if that is what is really happening, is a sign that the war is scaling down. Anybody who thinks that is delusional. It is a catastrophic level of loss, one which the Ukrainians cannot replace, and which is weakening their forces even further. It is true that because of difficult weather conditions and probably the priority given to clearing Toretsk and Chasiv Yar and to breaking resistance in the Andreevka area south of Kurakovo, that the pace of the Russian advance over the last few weeks has slowed. But that is a common event in this war. The Russians advance very fast. They capture important strategic positions. They then have to sort out their logistics. After they've done that, another big advance happens when weather conditions improve. We saw that after the fighting in Avdiivka, when for a short time it looked as if the Russians were being held at places like the village of Berdichi. And I remember for about 6 weeks, people were saying that the Ukrainians had stabilized the front lines, except, of course, that they had done no such thing. So this is delusional. In fact, all the facts point in one clear direction. Not only further Russian advances, but also the strong probability that we are going to get a major Russian offensive in the spring. An offensive to perhaps clear the Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, Konstantinovka area, which it's perhaps worth pointing out is still in population and density terms smaller than Mariupol and Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, just say, but also probably to break Ukrainian resistance in Pokrovsk, which looks threadbare, increasingly threadbare, and to reach the Dnieper River, something which I think there's a fair chance the Russians will have done by midsummer. So there is no stabilization, no real stabilization or slowdown of the situation on the front lines. It is a fantasy to think that. I think it is highly likely also that at some point over the next few months, the final act of the Kursk debacle for Ukraine will play out. The Russians have now also established a strong treaty relationship with Belarus, whose leader, Alexander Lukashenko, has now been re-elected as leader of Belarus. The Russians have strong forces in Belarus. Their position in the northern front lines is gradually getting stronger. It looks like Volchansk will come fully under Russian control at some point in the next few weeks. So it is not impossible that maybe in the second half of this year we will see a major Russian advance in the north as well, ultimately towards Kiev. And of course, bear in mind that according to the Russians themselves, from around mid-year, production of Oreshnik missiles will have achieved that level that the Russians will be able to launch missile strikes across Ukraine of a level of power that we have not yet seen at any point up to now in this war. So the military situation, exactly as Budanov says, continues to deteriorate. There is the other narrative that the Russian economy is overextended and is about to collapse. This has gained a huge amount of currency. It's been picked up by President Trump. He's repeated this. I've said in recent programs that we've had somewhat unexpected news over the last couple of days, that there was a major uptick in economic growth at the end of 2024, which continues into the beginning of 2025. Well, since then, since I made those programs, in fact, over the last 24 hours, Putin has had a meeting in Moscow with his Prime Minister, Mr. Mishustin, and they have discussed the overall economic situation in Russia. And for those who believe that the Russians are under some intense kind of economic pressure, this should make concerning reading. First of all, Mishustin reported to Putin that the economic figures for 2023 have been revised upwards. The previous estimate was the GDP growth in 2023 was 3.6%. It has now been revised upwards to 4.1%. I, by the way, have in previous programs said that I thought this would turn out to be the case. I expected that we would see GDP growth in Russia eventually reassessed at closer to 4% than the 3.6% that had been reported previously. Mishustin also said that economic growth in Russia in 2024 is now estimated to be in GDP terms, 4.1%. In the last weeks of 2024, the forecasts were that economic growth in Russia in 2024 would be 3.9%, GDP growth would be 3.9%. But in the event, it turned out to be faster in December than anyone had expected. And the current estimate is that it came out at 4.1%. Now, that is an estimate. And just like the original 3.6% GDP increase for 2023, which was revised upwards to 4.1%, I expect that this GDP figure for 2024 is going to be revised upwards as well. I would not be surprised if, when all the calculations are eventually done, when all the information is obtained from the businesses and companies across Russia, when tax receipts are checked, when the computers do their processing, that we will eventually find that GDP growth in Russia in 2024 was above 4.5%. By any objective calculation, that is a boom. If you had 4% growth at this time in any European country or in the United States, people would recognize that as a boom. If I am right in thinking that GDP growth in Russia was more than 4.5%, then GDP growth in Russia in 2024 would have been only slightly lower than in China. Just saying. So, we are looking at very, very rapid growth. And Mishustin has given us details about the major growth drivers. Apparently, the biggest one is manufacturing. Manufacturing grew by 8.5% in year-on-year in 2024. It grew, by the way, by 8.3% in January, 8.3% in January 2025, higher than in January 2024, just saying. And Mishustin has also given us a breakdown of where the major growth drivers were. And it is very interesting. The main, and I'm quoting from him directly now, the main contribution to the dynamics of manufacturing industries, what became the driver, was made by the machine building complex. It provided about 40% of the total growth in output. At the same time, it increased production by almost 20%, or 19.5% to be exact. Double-digit growth rates were shown by transport engineering, 29.6% for the automotive industry, 16.5% for the production of computer and electronic equipment, computer and electronic equipment was 28.8%. Car production was 16.5%. And medicines, pharmaceutical products, was 18%. And this gives us an idea of where the main growth drivers are coming from. Firstly, it is clear that spending on the war and higher fiscal spending by the government has increased demand, and that demand is acting as a reason for Russian companies to expand their output. But the main growth driver is that with the withdrawal from the Russian economy of Western companies, Russian businesses and manufacturing industries are stepping up their production to fill the gap, and that is resulting in very high investment rates obtained on the basis of preferential loans. and that those high investment rates are leading to a supply side revolution with major expansion in manufacturing driven by machine building. So quite different from the gas station masquerading as a country theory, which still seems to hold people like Kellogg and Waltz in their grip. Now, I know that there are people who are going to push back and are going to say that there's no reality to these Russian numbers, that Mishustin is lying to Putin, that this is all smoke and mirrors, that it's all fictitious and untrue. People are also going to point to the inflation rate, but then rapid growth, particularly an investment boom, one to some extent powered by high demand dynamics, would be expected to have some effect on inflation, to cause some degree of overheating in the economy. And Mishustin said to Putin that the major drivers for inflation are starting to slacken as credit growth, consumer credit growth, is starting to fall on the back of tighter monetary conditions. I don't think you can dismiss or write off or ignore Russian figures in this kind of way, because they are consistent with the information we're getting from the ground, from what is actually happening in Russia itself, from what Russians themselves tell us, and from what Western visitors to Russia tell us. The Russians are increasing production and are replacing the products that they used to import from the West. That is the overall story of what we're seeing now. And that takes me back to this idea that you can somehow force the Russians to change course by tightening sanctions on them. Not only would doing that infuriate and anger many third countries, but it's not going to stop this Russian expansion. Even if there is a significant reduction in Russian energy exports, which is possible, though I personally think unlikely. It's likely that the Russians will make up in terms of revenue for any fall in volumes as a result of the higher prices that causes. And besides, the major driver in Russian economic expansion now is not export revenues, as many people insist and want to believe. It is the development of the Russian economy itself. If Kellogg and Waltz get their way, what is already shaping into a debacle for the United States is going to be far worse. Mike Waltz, in particular, is said to be haunted by the humiliation of the fall of Kabul in Afghanistan in 2021. Apparently he served in Afghanistan, as did many of the veterans, the veteran military officers who have now become such important figures within the Trump administration. Some of them, Mike Waltz specifically, to some extent apparently even Tulsi Gabbard, believe that if Iraq was the bad, illegal war that should never have been started, then Afghanistan was the good war. The war which was betrayed, where the Taliban was given back power and where the United States was humiliated. I don't agree with that narrative, by the way. I think that it is wrong in many fundamentals, but I'm not going to waste time debating that. What I will say is this: the parallel that Mike Waltz and Kellogg should be worried about is not the fall of Kabul in 2021, a relatively minor event in global terms, one which the United States was able to brush off, and one which made no fundamental difference to the overall geopolitical picture. The event that they should keep in mind and which should haunt them is the fall of Saigon in 1975. Kiev is a much more important city than Kabul is. Ukraine is a country that is part of Europe, that adjoins Central Europe, one of the key areas of American power. And if Kiev falls in a disorganized way, if there is a military collapse there, as there was in Saigon in 1975, then the repercussions will be very great, and in fact greater than they were at the time of the fall of Saigon, where despite the humiliation and the defeat, to some extent at least, the damage was contained. I've said repeatedly that if you want to draw comparisons with any war that the United States has fought, and the United States is fighting in Ukraine, it is waging a proxy war there, and maybe American ground forces and aircraft are not involved, but there are many, many American technicians and spies and scientists and intelligence officers and command officers and all sorts of people, both on the ground in Ukraine and running the Ukrainian part of the war by remote control from NATO headquarters in Brussels and from Washington. If you want to talk about an American defeat on a really big scale, then this war in Ukraine parallels Vietnam much more closely than any other conflict that the United States has fought since then. Now, it may be that at the end of this, even if there is a negotiated solution, there will be a change in power in Kiev, and new authorities will come to power there, and they may be more sympathetic to Moscow than the existing ones. But even if that is the outcome of a negotiation, it is better that it were done in that way than that we have the kind of scenario that played out in Saigon, where tanks, enemy tanks, if I can call them that, advanced and broke through the gates of the presidential palace. I would have thought that was obvious, quite apart from the immense damage that those images will cause to the stature of the United States and to the authority of the president. If events like that happen, if the Russians besiege and capture Kiev in that sort of way, then it's very, very difficult to see how the United States and Russia will be able to come to terms in the future in order to stabilize the situation in Europe. And then those predictions by people at the Institute for the Study of War about how defeat in Ukraine will oblige the United States to maintain an indefinite, strong military presence in Europe, tying down American resources in Europe at a time when American officials themselves say that they need to redeploy them to the Pacific. It is impossible to see how that scenario will be avoided. And of course, I'm not even talking here about the effect on Ukrainians and on Ukraine if we come to that sort of outcome. Now, it may be that in their own interest, the Russians will decide that they don't want to take Kiev. They might choose to stop before they do that. Some would say that would be the wise thing for them to do. But if the Americans come up with proposals that the Russians cannot work with and won't accept, and if the Russians conclude that advancing westwards is the only way that they can secure their own defences and their future security, well, at that point, they may decide that they have no choice. I think that many of the articles that have appeared, with which, by the way, I generally agree that for the Russians, it doesn't make best sense to try to occupy the whole of Ukraine or most of Ukraine or to take Kiev or Lvov or any of these places. One of the things that many of these commentaries in the West miss is that if the Russians decide that taking Kiev and taking Lvov is the only way that they can establish the security of their western borders, despite their own misgivings and their own doubts, they will decide to do it. And we are getting closer to that point when they will be able to. So, I do hope that in spite of everything, good sense will eventually prevail. No doubt, Kellogg himself is now committed to a certain process. I think we have to accept that this is going to have to play out. He's going to go to Munich, and by the way, I think that's a mistake. I think that announcing a peace plan in Munich is an extremely bad idea. I think the best thing for Kellogg to have done before he announced a plan was to talk to the Ukrainians and the Russians first and to work out what their thinking was. I think coming up with a plan and presenting it to the Russians, especially, might work in the world of real estate deals. But as I've said many times, international diplomacy is not the same thing. So anyway, I think that was a mistake. But anyway, Kellogg has committed himself to doing that. He will no doubt then go to Kiev, and he will go to Moscow, I presume, at some point. He will probably meet Ryabkov there, and perhaps Lavrov, and conceivably even Putin himself. But when the Russians say no, I hope that the understanding exists in Washington that one should take that Russian no for an answer. We are long past the point when the Russians can be bullied or pressured or forced or bribed into negotiating an outcome that they consider unsatisfactory to themselves. I don't believe that the Russians are going to make any sort of sudden concessions. I see no sign from any Russian official that that idea is even being entertained. I think the idea that massive sanctions across the board are going to change anything misreads both the reality of the Russian economy and the response of most countries to the sanctions around the world. Whether that ability, that imagination to take no for an answer exists in Washington remains to be seen. But as we enter the end game in Ukraine, it is the big question that we must wait to see the answer to. Anyway, that's my program for today. Let me remind you again that you can find all our various programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can check out our shop where you will find all the amazing things that we have there. Links under this video. Also, last but not least, if you like this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.